So welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. This is a session from CultureLab about talking about why we make documentaries and why make documentaries as a theme, but also why we make it as filmmakers, as staff from CultureLab, as students and emerging filmmakers. We thought it's a really interesting question to explore. We've got a kind of diverse group of people on the panel today to talk about it. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name's Alastair Cole. I'm a lecturer in film practice here at Film at CultureLab. I'm a documentary filmmaker as well. You can see more about what I do on our profiles, but I'll be chairing the discussion today as opposed to sharing too much, but I think we're aiming to have a nice conversation between us all around this theme. So I'll ask if people can just go around, maybe to start with Ian. And just a quick intro, then we'll see where that takes us.
Well, my name is Ian MacDonald. I'm a reader in film practice in Film at CultureLab at Newcastle University, and I'm also a documentary filmmaker. We'll talk more about that soon.
Maybe, where are we? Alec?
My name is Alec Boyd. I am a soon-to-be graduate of film practices at Newcastle University, and hoping to continue on and become a documentary filmmaker on the back of this degree.
Great. Carol?
I'm Carol Lynn, and I'm a lecturer in film practice at Newcastle, and I'm also an independent documentary filmmaker.
Nuela?
I'm Nuela Fowler, and I'm also a soon-to-be graduate of film practice at Newcastle. And I also hope to go on and do work in documentary filmmaking, as well as, kind of other creative practice as well.
Thanks. And Evry?
And I am Evripidis Karydis. I am just out of the PhD adventure, becoming doctor in film practice, and I am a teaching assistant at Film at CultureLab, Newcastle University, and an independent documentary filmmaker as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And so I'll start with this. I mean, I think we should start on an individual level. We all have made films in different contexts, and be that within the degree or be that out in the wider world as well. And I think if I can ask you to think back even to one film or to talk through one film about why you made that film, or why we make documentary films in general. And I suppose in the context of your own practice as well, I know for me it's a combination of a lot of elements with different projects that dictate different responses to that. But I suppose I don't know if Carol, you wanted to start, or Ian's putting his hand up there as well.
Sorry. No, it's not very appropriate for me to behave like this, but I just wanted, because before that discussion happens, I just thought there's one thing I wanted to say in this forum, and before we talk specifically about our films and why we make them, and that is really like when I introduced myself at the beginning, when I said I'm a documentary filmmaker, it still feels funny to say that. I still feel like a bit pompous or a bit overblown, is a bit undeserved. And I'm interested to know why is that? And I think for me anyway, it's because growing up and being a student, and for the first part of my working life until I was in my mid-30s, I never made a documentary. It wasn't something that I could even aspire to do. Documentary or filmmaking, that world of filmmaking was so inaccessible. It was, you had to go to a film school, or you had to be in the family business in some way. It was completely or some kind of family connection, you're into home movies. So I related to film and cinema very much as a film buff, going, sort of watching it on the big screen, or as an activist using film in campaigns. But the idea of making them, which just seems completely out of reach until really the digital revolution, which opened up, really democratized filmmaking and made it possible for those that didn't have that specialist training or didn't inherit it in some way to sort of access filmmaking. So, and I just think that's something that's worth reminding ourselves about, because again, when I was the age of Alec and Nuela, there wasn't things like film practices degrees. They just didn't exist. But now, the likes of, you know, the younger generation now, they're sort of growing up more or less, you know, with the means of filmmaking in their hands, and they're going to university and making films. So, and of course, that's to be celebrated. And I think that's brilliant, because these guys won't have the hang-ups that we have, or I have, when I still think, you know, I'm a filmmaker. It's kind of like, but, you know, I'm a person who makes film. That's how I still see myself. And it's only when you've made films and they go to festivals and you're introduced as the filmmaker. First of all, you're like, I remember the first time I was introduced, and here is the filmmaker, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, that's me. And then sort of go up and talk about my film. It takes a while to sort of become the filmmaker, own that identity. And now probably, you know, sort of, I made my first film in 2000. I started filming in 2003. The film wasn't ready until 2006. And here we are, you know, 14 years later, and I've made 10 or 11 films since then. I guess I am now comfortable by saying I'm a filmmaker, but I just wanted that historical perspective, because it's not that long, actually. You know, it's the last couple of decades, this has become possible.
Do you think that their identities change then? That's an interesting point to start, because you know, Alec and Nuela are coming through as filmmakers. They're filmmakers right now, and that has their identity changed about who can be and who is and what is a filmmaker from what we grew up with, or you grew up with.
I think I understand the sort of like the feeling of like the pompousness of calling yourself a filmmaker, and I think it was probably sort of towards the end of second year when I felt like I had sort of a body of work where I could sort of see my skills sort of like developing at the point when I sort of started to say, yes, I'm a filmmaker. This is what I want to go on and do, and this is what I've sort of learned so far, and this is a style that I'm enjoying and sort of like honing and sort of working on. I think that's sort of like the point when I'd sort of stopped saying, oh yeah, I just sort of study film, to actually I am a filmmaker. And when I sort of started to think about my films outside of an educational sort of context.
I think
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Ian. And you know, like you say, in courses, filmmaking courses didn't exist unless you were, you know, sort of very select few and part of a kind of industry, you know, sort of boys club, old boys network type thing. And I think the democratization of equipment, and you know, everybody can, you know, sort of get access to a smartphone, you know, you can put stuff online, it's definitely made things better. And now, you know, there are more, obviously courses, there are more, I mean, my course, I started, art, really. It was filmmaking as part of art, as part of an art degree, and you know, with people like Jane Louise Wilson and Clio Barnard and people, and it wasn't, you know, like filmmaking as it is now. And you know, I think unless you work in industry and you're a you know, practitioner in industry working for, you know, the BBC, a documentary filmmaker, that kind of title does, you know, sometimes jar a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting place to start with this, obviously, and I mean, it's also what constitutes a filmmaker today, and where these films go, and where our films get shown, and at what point, you know, is that title, is it justified? Does it mean something different today?
That's just on that. It's a strange thing, because now, like, it's great that democratization and everyone's making a film, but I want to resist now everyone saying they're a filmmaker. You know, I'm kind of pushed back saying, you know, people so easily say I'm a filmmaker. No, just because you kind of make films doesn't make you a filmmaker. I know I can write, you know, I can even write stories, but I would never call myself a writer. And I think we have to have that same kind of approach to filmmaking. Otherwise, why are we asking students to come and spend 3 years with us and learn the craft and learn about the history and learn about, you know, it's a process of training and education and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's great that it's opened up, but now we have to say, but there's more to making films and pointing and shooting and upload. And I think something that Alex said earlier about the audience, you know, the ability to make work that goes beyond our circle, goes beyond our family, goes beyond, you know, all that to speak to a broader audience is really what I think. Once you've reached that, you can start to call yourself a filmmaker, once you're communicating to an audience beyond your immediate circle, I think you can call yourself a filmmaker. And that is a tremendous privilege, but also a massive responsibility, which maybe will come on later, you know.
And this is why I think universities, and specifically our university plays a really important role with that, because people come to the school and they come with a certain kind of like state of mind of what documentary or filmmaking is, and then you start going into the program and you realize, you know, it's not like that, and then you start developing your skills, like Alex said, and then, you know, you can start making films, you can start improving your craft and seeing the world with different eyes, and producing really interesting and engaging films. And I think universities should be, you know, even more helpful with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree, because I think when I started university, like you say, I maybe had an idea of what documentary was, but it was very, very limited. But I more thought about what kind of thing I'd be interested in, and so I thought it'd be something I'd enjoy doing. But actually, like, coming to university, I hadn't really engaged with filmmaking much beyond doing it on my art foundation, so in like a more kind of just self-taught kind of artistic way than like the documentary that we've been studying more here. But I think, like Al said, that I definitely, when I came, wouldn't have described myself as a filmmaker at all, but just through managing to like learn so much more about the theory behind it as well, I think was really helpful to that, and to kind of to exploring your own practice but kind of understanding it at the same time was really helpful, and like an important part of me maybe more starting to consider myself a filmmaker as well. So I agree, like university's been like such a help with that.
Well, I think it's really interesting between the two of us, Nuela, because you, as you say, you came to it from a sort of self-taught art foundation sort of point, but I'd studied film at GCSE and A-level, which I know the majority of people in our sort of class and cohort didn't even know in some cases that you could do like a GCSE in it and stuff. And I think it's still it's not very widely sort of taught. And I even when I did them both in Sheffield, but we did the Welsh examination board for it because that was one of the only boards that was offering a sort of film studies course, but be one that had some like practical elements in it as well.
The other thing I think is worth noting here, especially I'm just also now thinking about who might be listening to this and they're thinking about coming to study with, you know, study filmmaking or study documentary filmmaking. Point that Nuela makes, I think, about, you know, what do we, and Evripidis said about what do we understand by documentary? It's such a loaded term in some ways, and which is why we say that we're engaged in filmmaking, and that's important for me, because filmmaking, but we're using real life or real people as the material for our stories, or to express something, to say something about the world, and that's really what we mean by documentaries. Although of course we understand for most people documentaries is like the poor cousin of you know, the fiction film, and that's the stuff that you're forced to watch at schools because it's edifying, you know, it's good for education and you learn something. Actually, I grew up loving films, but pretty much hating documentaries, because that was what we got. You know, they were just like boring, like illustrated lectures. But yeah, discovering that documentaries is a much broader palette, and documentaries, it really is just another form of filmmaking, and in some ways a more demanding form of filmmaking. So discovering the observational filmmakers, for example, was a revelation to me, because I was watching them, people, you know, where you don't have someone telling you what's going on, you don't have music to tell you how to feel, and it's much more open-ended, and it's about real people and real lives and action unfolding in front of your eyes. Apart from, you know, just the brilliance of the craft that goes into capturing something like that, it's much more difficult than just sitting someone down and interviewing them when all under a controlled situation. To capture that, I was always like amazed by people's ability to do that. But also, I'm watching a film, you know, it's like I'm then immersed in story and character and narrative. I'm watching a film, and the fact that it's real gives it an extra excitement. And the discovery of that, I think for me was really revelatory. And that's kind of, I think, how we try to present it as well on the program. So when people say, you know, documentary, but it's filmmaking. And so documentaries, it's just an industry or term that's grown up, which has become very narrow. But we try and break through that, really.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time right now, obviously, and people, I mean, it's been referred to as a golden era of documentary right now, and I think, does that resonate with Alec and Nuela? I mean, is that how you have seen documentary coming in? Maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, is it still the poor brother of fiction, or have things moved on? Because I know for me it was 20 years ago for sure. It was a similar situation. There was some great films out there, but they had to be found. You had to really dig, and you had to be fortunate and find a film festival and do these things. But we all know there's been a massive change and shift in how we view and consume films. But is documentary still the poor cousin?
I think that it depends on what type of documentary maybe that you look at as well. Because like I was kind of saying, when I came to uni, so 3 years ago, my idea of it was more the stuff that you can see online on more like streaming services like Netflix and things, and a lot of them more kind of like maybe like traditional narrated documentaries and things like that. And I wasn't necessarily aware of the kind of, I guess, how many forms of documentary you have and kind of like how big a field it is. And so I think, like you say, it does take going out and finding it. And I think maybe for a lot of people, there's just not an awareness that there is that much out there to kind of find and to look at. But I do think that, just among my peers, like at uni and things, there is definitely a lot of interest in documentaries with a lot of my friends who don't study film. So I don't think it is like related just specifically to if you want to make it, you also want to watch it. I think, obviously, I don't know maybe how it was 10, 20 years ago, but nowadays, I think a lot of people our age are actually interested in engaging with documentaries and watching them, even though it might be slightly different formats to what we'd make.
Yeah, I think the format's an important point to sort of mention about the change, really, because I think in terms of people's accessibility to documentary, it is easier than ever because things are being produced for sites such as like Netflix and things like that. Like the sort of like long form 8-hour-long episode documentary things was something that wasn't really sort of like about until relatively recently. And now, you wouldn't necessarily have thought maybe 5-10 years ago people would be sitting and binging 10 hours of documentary at a time. But now, yeah, it's just as much, it's just as binge worthy to especially the circles that sort of like we're in, than other stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it brings us around nicely in a way. So there's audiences are there and education's there if you want to pursue that. But then there's a kind of this overarching question of why do this? I mean, why are we doing what we're doing? I mean, why should not just our films perhaps get made, but also other films? I mean, I don't know if Evry, you wanted to start perhaps. I mean, you talk a little bit about your filmmaking, because I think you cover a lot of interesting areas, and including from the personal to the big themes as well. I mean, as a filmmaker, why do you do what you do?
Well, the thing personally for me is I have an idea of giving voice to people who are not able to express themselves in the mainstream media, and my idea of changing people's perspectives and point of views on specific groups of people, like I don't know, like football fan activists, for example, because that was the topic of my PhD film as well, and then personal stories. Everybody has a story to tell, and if you go out there and you are in the world, you can find interesting people doing interesting things, and you want to tell those people's stories, but in a way that you can make it like creative and maybe educational or entertaining, but with the traditions of like the filmmaking craft, which is also my kind of like personal angle of how I see things, because you're out there in the world with your camera, and you just observe everyday life, and you want to present it to the world. And if they find it interesting and engaging, good. If not, still people will not find everything we do engaging. But it's all about I think finding interesting stories to tell, changing people's perspectives, having people after they watch your films to go have moment, like that moment at the end. Leave the room or the theater or whatever your film is being screened with kind of like an idea, like you made people change their ideas about specific things. And if you make like one or two think like that, then I think it's a success.
Yeah, I think it's a common thing though. You often find out with documentary filmmakers is the idea of giving a platform, giving a voice, and to people who might otherwise not have the privilege of being able to speak for themselves, and it's about changing hearts and minds. That's kind of the relationship that we need to negotiate, where we listen to them and get them to tell their story in order to change your mind or to get you think differently. So we're all in the business in some way of trying to affect change or improve things or rectify something. It doesn't have to be like that, of course. There are many, many motivations, but I think that was probably my starting point as well. I came into academia, as I say, not as a filmmaker, but basically as a sociologist. But my approach to sociology was always to do exactly that, to sort of research topics that had been ignored in order to bring them to a broader audience, and always part of an engagement with power in some ways, of trying to challenge power relationships or equalize power to try and create a more equal, better, more progressive, inclusive societies. There was always a kind of a political dimension. And what I found doing that as a sociologist, it was ultimately ineffective because the audience, I mean, you write an article, and you get it published. And in my day, it just sat on a library. Now it sits on some file somewhere, and the only people that read it are probably the students that you forced to read it because you put it on the reading list of the module. And all that work and all that effort doesn't seem to be proportionate. And ultimately, it's not really successful in affecting change. So for me, the shift to documentary, the opportunity to move into documentary was to do those things, but in a much more impactful way. And that you can, because it's a visual medium. And I think the question is always, why documentary? There are certain topics that lend themselves to documentary, and there are certain ways of seeing and thinking that you can present to people that only documentary can do, because it's not just words on a page, but it's images and sounds which convey emotion, which have impact. So I think you can move an audience in a way that's very difficult to move an audience just when they're reading something. So I think that's the power of documentary for me, really, as a tool of communication, as a means of prompting, provoking discussion, which I think is the first step to any real meaningful change, is that people have to can't impose it upon people, and you can't say, you should do this because it's the right thing. People have to think it through themselves. They have to discuss it and be convinced themselves. That, for me, is the first step towards proper change. And documentary can do that very, very well. It doesn't give you the answers, but it can give you the questions and give you something to think about. So that's why, for me, it's probably still the reason why I make documentaries. And just on a personal level, just to finish on that, it's also, I find it, thank God the digital revolution happened, because I just find it so much more meaningful and fulfilling. When I started, making films, it was like that moment I think, this is what, it sounds corny, but this is what I was born to do. And I found something I can really throw myself into 100% without reservation, in a way that I'd never done with anything before. That this is really what I found that I could express myself and what I wanted to say. And it was also the most challenging thing that I'd ever done. Writing an article, ultimately the form is quite easy. Once you've mastered the art of writing an article, it's all quite, but filmmaking is challenging, new all the time, every time, in new and different ways. So I really like that aspect of it as well. You constantly have to develop and keep moving forward with the form. But yeah, so it's that opportunity to be critical in the academic sense of engaging with politics and power and challenging injustice and give voice to marginalized people. You know, and we're in an era of Black Lives Matter, and you think, how can I as a white man make a difference? Well, I can go there and amplify those voices, you know, and I can go there and capture those stories and present them. And so that's a contribution that that filmmaking can give us. But also, so it's about that, but it's also about, I think, creativity. You know, I think all humans ultimately, we're all creative beings, and I really push against this idea of the creative artist, you know, that somehow all 6 of us here have got some kind of creative talent. You know, it's out there amongst everybody. We've all got that creativity. And it's about, you know, facilitating ways in which people can express that. And for us, obviously, it's through film. But for me, the opportunity, not just to be critical and political and educational, but in the process to be creative with that, to think about aesthetics, to think about, you know, how that's expressed. That is really fulfilling, you know, in terms of, you know, my own development, I think.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's, yeah, there's lots of, be it in, you know, a fascination with the topic and interest in a topic, and the activism side, and I suppose there's what you both mentioned is around your own values, and I thought maybe, Carol, you might like to mention here, because both your films, or both Join the Dots and Riverside, or the project around music in Newcastle, you're from the Northeast. These are stories of the Northeast in a lot of ways. Is there an element of the personal in there that's important for you, or?
There's definitely an element of the personal important, and you know, for the Riverside documentary, I'm very much into music, and I attended there, and it was a very special time. But I recognised, you know, that was a great story, you know, a sort of venue, a cooperative venue being set up in, you know, sort of Thatcher's Britain, by the kids, run by the kids, for the kids kind of thing. And, you know, so it was about a lot of the people who set that up, you know, just these kids who set the venue up, but then went on to become, you know, sort of got some of the highest sort of ranking sort of musicians to play, you know, from like Nirvana played their first ever gig there, through to they got David Bowie to play there at a really small intimate gig, to Red Wedge Tour playing there, you know, so you know, you end up sort of going the whole spectrum on something like that, from interviewing, you know, really sort of small people who, you know, just, you know, local people who were involved in setting it up, right through to, you know, people who are famous, like, you know, interviewing artists who played there, like, you know, the Pixies, Black Francis I've interviewed, and Henry Rollins and people like that. And, you know, you kind of find that it was special to them as well, because it was kind of before they were famous. So there's, you know, there's a common sort of theme going on about this kind of passion in music. But yeah, I mean, it's a, you know, it's like what Everett said, everybody has a story to tell, and you know, I think whether it's a small story told big, or a, you know, long form piece, you know, like the Riverside documentary, which is, sometimes I ask myself why I am making documentaries, because it takes so long when you're doing something like that, a long form one, you know, and sometimes you lose a lot of the buzz and the craft and the just getting something instant done, you know, where you can do with a short film, and that's back to the, you know, democratization and the instant, you know, sort of just filming something and getting it online. You know, when you go through a long form and something lasts a long time, it you know, you kind of sometimes wonder, but then hopefully you get your passion back as it, you know, sort of builds momentum again. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of telling voices, you know, telling stories of people, like you say, who maybe they wouldn't have had the stories told, but then again, those who are already famous and have their stories told, but are telling a different part of their story. But it is about the, you know, the skills, the craft, the you know, as well. It's not, you know, and this is what we were saying before about the democratization. It's still about, you know, not everybody can do it. You know, you can learn those skills, and you can maybe learn those skills DIY, because I also come from a DIY background, you know, sort of independent sort of punk attitude, where, you know, sort of people were doing it for themselves. So, you know, I think there is part of that, but I think, you know, you do need to learn some of the skills as well, and I think that's what the university teaches people. It teaches it introduces people to all of those different themes and modes and types of documentaries, and about the craft, and about all the different right from your, talking heads through your poetic, more experimental films. So, you're introduced to all of this, and that all becomes part of your craft, and, as part of the journey. And, it is about creativity. It's a, and I think it's a compulsion as well. You're compelled to, sort of make films. It's a passion, I guess.
And it's the sense of satisfaction you get at the end, I think, also when you finish the film, because you dedicated time and effort, and you finally finish this, and you look at it and you present it out to the world, and of course the feeling of watching on the big screen, it's something else, it's something you made, and it's brilliant. Yeah.
I think that's a nice point. I mean, both Alec and Nuela, you've finished your films, your final year films now, and I think one of the points that came up for me that resonates with your work as well is this idea of creativity in documentary film, and embracing creativity, and you guys do that in the way you make films. I don't know if you wanted to share a bit about your thoughts around approaching these last films that you've made, or any films you've made, and the creative decisions, especially about why you've done certain things you've done.
New, do you want to start?
Yeah, can do. I don't know. I think that a lot of it, I guess, was informed by the things that we learned at university that I didn't necessarily realise was kind of a way to make films before. So, like you were saying about like poetic mode and observational mode, and kind of learning more about all these different ways that you can tell stories. And I was just very interested to kind of see how I could engage with those and push myself to get a bit more creative with things. And I think personally, like when I made a film called Meet last year with another one of my course mates, Tilly, I think that what we tried to do is kind of explore storytelling in a very different way to what we tried to do before. And I think personally I'm a very like visual person, like in terms of the films. The way that I approach films is a lot of the time heavily kind of based on like the cinematography aspect of it, and how I can tell the story with like essentially minimal kind of narration or something that's not particularly like didactic, and it's not telling you how to think is kind of maybe the approach that I like to take. But I think that a lot of the time we've just been trying to kind of explore how we can push our own abilities in storytelling. And I think documentary has been like really, really good for that, and kind of studying documentary, because I just think it's just been really interesting to see like how we can tell stories in different ways. But like I say, I think a lot of the time it's like my approach to film is driven by the visual stuff, but also it's because I come from more of an art background, and so I like started out in fine art, and I did like art at school, and then I did my art foundation, and film was something that I hadn't necessarily considered. I thought I was going to be like a fine artist, but when it came to like my engagement with the subjects, I always kind of wanted to be able to engage more with it, and I wanted to have something that was a bit more interactive and kind of immersive than, because I was like originally more of a painter, and I wanted to create something that kind of like you were saying, Ian, that you can put out into the world and will be more effective at maybe creating change or telling someone's story, and kind of something that people can interact with and actually learn from. But I think that that I've come from maybe more of an art background, which is why a lot of my films kind of are more maybe based around like visual aspects and stuff. So yeah.
Just to let you know, Nuela, you won't know this, of course, but probably I read at least 4 student essays reflecting on their films who reference Meet, your second year film,
Oh, really?
as a major influence in their thinking about the possibilities of documentary.
Oh my God.
A couple of third years and at least 2, if not 3 second years, because we showed it to the second years. So yeah, you've become you've got a bit of a cult status now.
Ooh, that's great.
There's your impact there, Nuela. That's your impact.
Oh wow, that's very exciting. that people like it?
For me, I think generally, when it comes to sort of like the stories that I sort of like want to tell, I think there's a lot that can sort of be said for the sort of giving a voice to things and people that might not necessarily also have a way to project their voice. But I think I also like that in sort of a mundanity context, in sort of like finding the things that are kind of like everyday and trying to find the sort of like story in it. And I like the fact that you sort of, when you're thinking about what you're going to make a film about, all you can say is, I'm going to make a film about this. You can't say, and this is how it's going to end, and this is what's going to happen in it. I like the fact that you go and you find something, like for instance, I like to make films about people within their context. So like my final dissertation film, the original dissertation film I was going to make was about the village where I spend a lot of my time, and it was all about the people and the profiles, the characters that are in there within the context of their community, and then within the context of the natural world around them. And then in the end, I tried to carry that forward and just do it about one person, which is my dad. And, you know, it was sort of like, okay, I know my dad's an eccentric figure and he lives in this beautiful place. I'm going to take a camera there and a couple of microphones and make a film about him. But do I have any idea what it's going to be about? No. And then that satisfaction of finishing the film, like you were talking about, Everest, is like, it's not just like, oh, I finished all the work on that. It's like, oh, that's how that turned out. That's, you know, when I started this process, all I was doing was, you know, effectively filming my dad. And I've found out this, you know, this sort of stuff and information along the way of doing it. And I think that sort of like creative practice is, and sort of the methodology of that is the main thing that I sort of learned through my university career, and the learning through doing, and the finding your way along as you sort of go.
I think that is why documentary is also exciting, because of how you can start with an idea, start filming, and then in the process something happens that you maybe didn't research at the beginning, or it's just unexpectedly happens and shifts your film in a different direction, and it's really exciting. It's really exciting when you go like you said, Alec, you go into something that you don't know how it's going to end. That is so exciting for me, starting a film. So yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah.
We're just working on a film. Everest and Ang, another PhD student, we're working on a film. Sorry, Evripidis is not a PhD student anymore.
Thank you, Ian.
You always picks me up. I refer to him as a PhD student. But as I told him yesterday, you'll always be my PhD student. That's it. So
yes, that's a title. That's a title I can live with. For your PhD student, yeah, forever. Yeah.
We've been making a film for the past year on the North of Tyne Mayor, Jamie Driscoll. So we've been kind of in the observational mode. So we've been following him around, and we always had the idea that it would be like the first 12 months, first year in the office of, and we had the ending worked out as well, because they told us at the end of the first year they were going to be moving premises, you know, from one office to another office, which was the big new building in Newcastle, you know, the big tower block that's coming up outside the Helix. And the mayor was going to be on had the top floor, and we have the whole, you know, vista of Newcastle before him. So we even had to frame everything, you know, of the mayor sitting there and looking at his kingdom, and that would play with the idea of this man as a socialist, you know, as kind of committed to the underprivileged and all of that kind of stuff, and it bring out all those contradictions of politics. So we thought that was a nice ambiguous ending. That was the plan, wasn't it? And then, you know, where are we? You know, then you had bloody lockdown, which meant that filming had to stop, and we had to find another way of, because we still wanted to finish it within 12 months. So you have to respond. You can't say, well, we'll put it on pause, we'll wait for it to come back, and then we'll have that ending. No, you have to respond. Okay, this is the reality. The reality changed. It's a very difficult reality, because it's one where it's very difficult to film. So how do we get around that? And we got around that by asking Jamie, the mayor, and his sons to film themselves. And we've got all this lovely home footage, you know, which we could never get, but they got, because it's, you know, home footage of, you know, like I had the haircut, and you find out things about people. So suddenly, you know, Jamie, this mayor, who was suit and tie and speaking on rallies, we see him in the back garden practicing archery. you know, proper archery with his son. You know, these little things, which is like, and then they're coming out clapping the carers. And so this is now the end of the, I shouldn't give it away really. But anyway, so this is now the ending of the film. It ends with sudden interruption of reality into this film. But I think actually it's given us a much stronger ending.
Yeah,
and we could, then just him arriving in his new, so that's the thing, yeah, the unexpected. Who could have predicted? None of us predicted that, right? That this would be the situation. But it's given us, so I always think, what I always tell the students, you know, is in fiction, you're in control of the reality, but that's great. But then the limits of the reality is the limit of your imagination. But whereas if documentary, you're not, the limits of reality isn't the limits of your imagination. It's much bigger than that. And no one could have imagined this situation. So documentary just keeps giving, because life just keeps giving and gives you this really, really great material. So that is the, you know, sometimes it's a pain in the ass when that happens, like you're stuck in lockdown having to edit Alastair and deal with all of that remotely across countries. But sometimes, you know, it can give you these unexpected moments of revelation and joy. So yeah, it's like Alfred Hitchcock said, right? In fiction, director is God, but in documentary, God is the director. And this is what's happening now with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it's a pretty warped God right now. Oh, I think that's a fairly opt. I mean, we aim to get big, so that's nice. That's a nice grand moment to end on. And also because time's running out a bit. But listen, thank you all. That's a really great conversation, really lovely conversation. I think it's something that hopefully those watching will take something from, and it's been a pleasure to hear it all.